Slavery is often offered as an explanation for African American poverty rates. At first glance, this seems like a very silly explanation, since had slavery not taken place, African Americans would simply be Africans, and so would no doubt be poorer than they are today. But there's some sense in which people who say that slavery explains black poverty don't mean that it explains it in the normal sense of the word explanation. So they don't think that black poverty would be lesser had slavery simply not occurred, but rather what they mean is that black poverty would be lesser if African Americans had all been transported to America as free people instead of as slaves. Now, there's no plausible scenario in which this would have actually happened in the real world, but we are encouraged to treat this hypothetical seriously anyway, and if someone points out that if slavery had not occurred, black people would merely be in Africa, it's normally met with just a laugh and not really any kind of argument to explain why that isn't a valid consideration. I don't think that that's a justification for ignoring the obvious fact that slavery did not literally make African Americans any poorer than they would have been without slavery. But even if we set that aside and ask the question, would African Americans be richer today if they were free people in America at the time that they were slaves? The empirical evidence still suggests that the answer to that question is no. So the mechanisms by which slavery is normally said to have retarded black economic progress is by inhibiting black education, by destroying the black family, and by stopping black people from accumulating wealth that they could transfer to their offspring. The best evidence on the effects of slavery comes from comparisons of the descendants of free blacks from those who were enslaved and were emancipated following the Civil War. Beginning soon after emancipation, those black people who were freed from slavery were less literate and poorer than black people who were born free. This difference did persist for some time, but after 2 generations, the descendants of enslaved and free black Americans did not statistically differ in terms of their education or their economic success. This suggests that the effects of slavery had largely faded by the time we get to the grandchildren of slaves, and makes it highly improbable that such effects still linger today. This may seem surprising, but it is consistent with other data on the intergenerational effects of wealth in the 19th century in America and in the South. So there was a 2013 paper, for instance, which found that descendants of those who won Georgia's land lottery in the 1830s fared no better for it in terms of their income, wealth, and literacy rates. Looking at what is basically the opposite of that, a 2016 paper found that those who had their wealth destroyed during the Civil War thanks to slavery, emancipation, or because of property destruction had children that were only moderately worse off for that. So to be specific, they found that a person's wealth being decimated by 10% predicted a 0.4% decrease in their children's income. By the next generation, this effect probably would not statistically differ from 0, and it definitely wouldn't for the descendants born 100 years later. Now, this isn't even all that different from what modern studies find, and especially among African Americans, a subpopulation which seems to have a lot of trouble with the passing on of wealth. So there was a 2016 paper which found that a 10% increase in wealth among an American's grandparents predicted a 1.8% increase in their own wealth if they were white, but only a 0.2% increase in their wealth if they were black. An empirical finding which I think demonstrates the degree to which wealth does not stick in black families to a fairly extreme degree comes from this 2018 paper, which used census data to show that black children born in the top fifth of the income distribution were equally likely as adults to occupy the top and the bottom fifth of the income distribution. Again, this is race specific. White children born to the top economic quintile were far more likely to stay there than to fall to the bottom quintile. So the speed with which wealth fades across African American generations gives us good reason to doubt the differences in wealth from 150 years ago are still persisting in effect today. Now, it's worth noting that the idea that the effects of slavery would diminish after a few generations is consistent with the amount of time that it seems to have taken other populations to rebound from serious hardship. So this is similar to the time span that it seemingly took the Irish to recover from repression by the English, for Jewish people to recover following emancipation in Europe, for the Japanese to rebound following World War II, and for several Eastern European countries like Estonia to recover from communism. And so in general, it seems not unusual for populations to recover from significant hardship in just a couple generations. In fact, this seems to be the rule, and you would need an explanation for an exception to that rule. And I should note here that even if you think that there are other acts of oppression of African Americans that happened after slavery which are holding back them economically, that is a separate hypothesis from the hypothesis that slavery is causing their poverty today. Now, this idea that events that have an impact on a population have effects which fade fairly quickly is consistent even with what we see in the lives of individuals. So, for instance, if you look at meta-analyses of lots of studies on interventions that aim at improving the cognitive abilities of children by giving them special educational attention and improving their nutrition and giving their parents classes on how to parent better, we find that these interventions do improve cognitive ability, disability, but that this effect fades after just a few years, similar to what would happen if you put someone in an exercise program and saw them improve due to being essentially forced to exercise, and then watching the effects of that fade after the exercise program ended. Turning specifically to economic success, many people imagine that there is a strong effect of your parents' income on your income as an adult, and that is simply not true. There have been many twin studies, and there was a 2013 review of about 19 of these twin studies, which have shown that the correlation between parental income and offspring income is overwhelmingly explained by genetics and not an environmental factor. Similarly, there have been at least 2 adoption studies that I know of in the United States, which have shown that while being born into rich families predicts offspring being rich in biological families, it does not do so in adoptive families. Exactly what you would expect if genetics explained the correlation we normally observe. Now, sometimes it is noted that black families were broken up in slavery when people of the same family were sold to different slave owners, and that no doubt happened, and obviously that is tragic when it does happen. But the idea that black people today leave their children because their ancestors from the 1860s or before, who they have never met, were forcibly separated from their families is just totally without evidence. And the idea that these sorts of things explain modern black family structure, well, that's downright implausible, because black rates of single parenthood are much greater today than they were in the 18th century. Now, analyzing how African Americans have changed in a few other ways across time will give us even more reason to doubt that slavery is an important explanation for African Americans' socioeconomic status today. If slavery was an important explanation, then we might expect that the effects of slavery should be slowly but surely marginally decreasing each generation, and so we should see a slow but steady economic improvement among African Americans, and this is just not what the data shows. So, for instance, a 2017 report from the Federal Reserve shows that black and white working women had roughly the same wages in the 70s and 80s, and that it is actually only since the 90s that a gap has appeared which favors white women. For males, there was already a wage gap present in the 1970s, but it's even greater today. Now, with respect to males, many authors make the mistake of looking at the wages of working men when they're calculating the average earnings of black men, and treating that as if it is in fact the average earnings of black men, which doesn't take into account the effects of unemployment and incarceration. A 2017 paper made sure to not commit these errors, and they found a fairly striking result, namely that the difference between the median white and median black male in earnings is larger today than it was in 1940. With respect to net wealth, the situation is similar but even more extreme. Since the 1960s, the black-white wealth gap has increased many times over. If you look at employment, the black-white unemployment gap only appeared sometime in the 1940s, and it has only gotten wider since then. With respect to home ownership, a 2011 paper found that the black-white home ownership gap was larger in 2011 than it was in 1910. Now, if you look at the rate of poverty among African Americans, you see a significant decline roughly until the 1960s, at which point poverty actually began to rise, especially if when you calculate the incomes of African Americans, you exclude welfare payments, a measure called latent poverty. So nothing in this data looks like African Americans are slowly recovering from the economic effects of slavery, or I might add, anything else that took place in the early 20th century. This, combined with the direct data comparing the descendants of free and enslaved blacks, and the historical and contemporary data on the intergenerational transfer of wealth, and the historical recovery time for other populations following important hardships, well, all of these lines of evidence combined, I think, give us pretty good reason to reject the view that slavery is an important cause of modern black poverty rates. So that's the video. If you enjoyed it, consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. And if you enjoy the channel a lot, consider supporting it on Patreon or Subscribestar. And in any case, thanks for watching.